Listen, I've spent more years than I can count watching the stars drift by, but the real magic? It's never in the nebula clouds or the pulsar rhythms. It's in the way a person stops breathing for a second when someone else looks at them just a little too closely. It's messy and it's quiet. Truth is, Elias Thorne wasn't looking for a life partner when he walked into the galley of the Stellar Concorde. He was just looking for the caffeine levels required to survive another shift in the engine room. He was a man of routines, the hum of the vents, the smell of recycled air, and the exact weight of a ceramic mug in his hand. She calculated a perfect match. He just wanted his morning coffee. That was the start of it. Lyra was standing there right in the center of the research hub, only looking like she was made of moonlight and mathematical certainty. Ethorians don't really do the whole small talk thing. They don't do the, "Hey, do you want to grab a drink sometime?" dance that humans have perfected over centuries of awkward bar encounters. No, they have resonance, they have data, and apparently they have very public declarations. When she spoke his name, the entire room went silent. I mean, even the automated cleaning drones seemed to stop and listen. She didn't just say his name, though. She claimed him. It was a formal, ancient Ethorian cadence that sounded less like a request and more like a law being written into the ship's log. Elias just stood there. His thumb was tracing the rim of his cup, and he felt that weird, primal itch at the back of his neck. He looked around, hoping maybe there was another Elias Thorne hiding behind the nutrition dispenser. There wasn't, but the thing about humans is that we don't always react with logic. We react with our guts. And Elias's gut was telling him that the way Lyra's skin was shifting from a pale silver to a frantic, vibrating violet meant she was just as terrified as he was. The ship's legal counsel, a spindly thing with too many joints, showed up within minutes. It turns out that when an Ethorian researcher of Lyra's standing declares a resonance bond, it isn't a suggestion. It's a legally binding accident. Alien tradition meets human chaos, and suddenly Elias wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a candidate for a trial marriage. They were moved to a private observation deck to discuss the terms. The air was thick with what I like to call cultural static. You could practically hear the gears grinding as their two worlds collided. I don't know, maybe it was the way she kept adjusting her wrist cuff, her fingers moving with a precision that made Elias feel like a giant, clumsy thumb. She was all systematic data, and well, he was a guy who fixed things by hitting them until they sounded right. "I'm a scientist, Elias," she said. Her voice had this melodic tremor to it. I mean, it wasn't supposed to have a tremor. Ethorians are supposed to be the calmest beings in the quadrant, but her breathing was hitched, and her secondary heart was thumping so hard he could actually see the fabric of her tunic pulse. "My data indicates a 98% resonance compatibility. To ignore it would be inefficient." Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. It was lukewarm now. "Efficiency is great for engines, Lyra. But people, we're a disaster. We're unpredictable." "That is why the trial is necessary," she countered, her scales fluttering in a way that Elias found strangely and distractingly pretty. "We must prove the resonance through action. The High Matriarch demands it. If we cannot harmonize our natures, the bond is dissolved. But until then, we are tethered." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and he saw it. The fear of failing a tradition that had stood for 10,000 years. She was clinging to her math because it was the only thing she had. And Elias, he felt that weird human instinct to nurture, to soften the blow. He reached out, not to grab her hand, but just to steady her. He brushed a stray bit of lint off her sleeve. It was a small thing, a nothing gesture. But when his skin made contact with the fabric near her arm, Lyra's entire body stiffened. The violet hue of her skin deepened into a rich, bruised plum color. To her, it was a life-altering pact. To him, he was just fixing a sleeve. And that gap, that beautiful, baffling gap, was where the trouble really started. Because compatibility isn't about being the same, it's about filling the gaps. They were interrupted before he could say anything else. The comm system chirped with a frantic, sharp tone that only ever meant one thing. The High Matriarch Vora was on her way to inspect the match. Elias felt his stomach drop. He looked at his coffee, then at the ethereal woman who had just accidentally married him, and he realized he was going to need a much stronger drink. The matriarch didn't exactly walk into the room. She sort of loomed. When her scales were a deep, judgmental slate gray, and she looked like she'd forgotten how to smile about 3 centuries ago. She didn't look at Elias like he was a person. She looked at him like he was a smudge on a very expensive telescope. The math said yes, but the matriarch said prove it. She didn't use many words. She just stood there, her presence creating a heavy sort of pressure in the room, waiting for them to show her this supposed resonance. Lyra was vibrating, literally. The air around her was humming with a frantic, high-pitched frequency that made Elias's teeth ache. He could feel the cultural static thickening, a wall of expectation that neither of them knew how to climb. But then the ship decided to weigh in. It wasn't a loud noise. It was just a sudden, sickening drop in the floor's vibration. The lights flickered, shifting from a warm amber to a harsh emergency red. The life support cascade started with a hiss of failing seals 3 decks down. In a ship this advanced, a cascade is a death sentence if you wait for the computers to reboot. Lyra froze. Her mind was probably running 10,000 simulations a second, trying to find the perfect, systematic path to a reset. She was looking for a needle in a haystack made of light. Her breathing hitched, and her skin began to flicker through a panicked spectrum of jagged yellows. Elias didn't think. He didn't have time for math. He just felt the shift in his heels, the way the air was getting thin and smelling faintly of ozone. It was a gut feeling, a primal instinct that told him exactly where the heart of the machine had skipped a beat. "Hey, look at me," Elias said. He didn't shout. He just used that low, steady voice he usually reserved for calming down a blown fuse or a panicked kitten. "Lyra, look at my hand." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. Not a gentle brush this time, a firm, grounding grip, the tether. He could feel her pulse racing against his palm, a frantic staccato that didn't match the ship's dying rhythm. "I need you to bridge the flux," he whispered, pulling her toward the manual override panel. "I can bypass the physical seal, but I can't talk to the code. You have to be the one to tell the computer we aren't dead yet." Lyra's eyes were wide, her pupils blown out until they were almost all black. But when she looked at his hand on her arm, something shifted. The violet franticness in her skin began to settle into a steady rhythmic blue. She saw the way he was moving. Reckless, messy, but absolutely certain. Truth is, shared goals and actions often bridge language barriers better than words. They didn't need to discuss the philosophy of their union. They just needed to breathe. Elias ripped the panel cover off with a screech of metal. He started shifting gears, reaching into the guts of the machine with a wrench he'd pulled from his belt. He was bypassing safety protocols that were thousands of years old. It was messy. It was human. It was exactly what the situation needed. "Now," he grunted. Lyra's fingers moved over the interface with a precision that was nothing short of a miracle. She wasn't guessing. She was weaving her logic into his chaos, catching the loose ends of his improvisation and tying them into a perfect, systematic knot. She was the anchor to his storm. The hum came back. Not the old hum, but something new. A harmony. The red lights faded. The air softened. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was light. Elias let go of her wrist, suddenly aware that he was covered in a light sheen of sweat, and that he'd probably just offended every Ithorian sensibility in the book. He looked over at the matriarch, expecting a lecture on the sanctity of the equipment. Instead, Vora was looking at Lyra. Then she looked at Elias's hand, then back at the ship's readout. Tradition is a map, the matriarch said, her voice sounding less like stone and more like worn velvet. But a map is useless if the terrain has changed. You didn't follow the protocol. No, Elias said, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. Maybe we just improvised. Lyra stepped closer to him. She didn't look at the matriarch. She looked at the smudge of grease on Elias's thumb. She reached out and, with a shaky but determined hand, she covered his hand with her own. It was a resonance, Lyra said. Her voice was steady now. It was the math of the gap between us. The matriarch didn't say another word. She just inclined her head and drifted out of the room, leaving them in the quiet warmth of the observation deck. Elias looked down at their joined hands, one calloused and stained with work, the other shimmering and delicate. He realized then that he wasn't thinking about his morning coffee anymore. He was thinking about how his pulse finally felt like it was in sync with someone else's. And honestly, that was the only data point that mattered.